Standardized recipe cost cards. This lesson is going to discuss with you the extension of a standardized recipe from the planning and organization and the testing phase to now we're going to cost out our recipe, which will give us a lot of important information that we can use within our business. A standardized recipe, you're going to see a standardized name for the recipe. We even classify it at this is an entree, the restaurant name, the standard portion size provided, and the standard yield that this recipe is scaled for. One of the things that we want to talk about is how, as a manager, as a chef, as an owner, or even an operator, how do we make money? Well, that all comes down to how you manage the money that you have, and that extends from the decisions on the purchasing that you make, the product that you receive, the product that you store, you waste, you prep, and you sell. It also goes into how you prepare a menu mix or a sales mix and all of these different things that we will continue talking about throughout this course. We start off with this because it's the most similar to other topics that you've had in class or that we've discussed, not just in food and beverage cost control, but intro to culinary, intro to baking, thinking about stock soups and sauces, and so on. So what this recipe is, it's a fictitious recipe that I made up just for the practice to get the costing and so forth. So let me point out the keys to this recipe. So on the far side here, we're going to have what the recipe requires to be used to make the final recipe, or all of the 4-ounce portions that this should create 80 of them. So we have the quantity and the unit. These will always be separate in Excel, so you can do equations and calculations through it. If you have letters in with numbers, it won't calculate, so you always do separate columns. However, this is something that you've heard about, and this is going to be always considered your edible portion or your edible yield. And what that means is if an ingredient does not give you a 100% yield, that means you need to start with more than it needs to have what you need to make the recipe. So let me kind of clarify and jump over to another column. This one here. The as purchased is the way that we buy the product and it comes in through the back door from the vendor. This column is included, or these two columns, amount and the unit. And what this column represents is what you actually had to use to produce this. In this example, if I put 20 here, and that's each, that's equal, right? 20 each is 20 each. And I could do that because it's a 100% yield. So whether I'm going left to right, or I'm going right to left, that matches. Every other item in this example will not work that way because none of them are listed at 100% that we know of yet. So what we bought and used to produce this amount, to produce the total recipe, that's one of the key areas that people that lose their business or go under or don't know how to manage costs happen. And that's because they forget that they had to start off with this amount to get this. So they don't charge in their total recipe costs down here that they then put onto their menu. So those are our key columns initially. If the units don't match, you have to convert one of them so they match the other. So if this was in ounces, we'd either need to change this to pounds, or this one we would need to change to ounces. I'll show you here. These are not equal. 82% of a pound may equal ounces, but we still need to know other things, so we need to make sure that they are matching. And also, matching units or signs cancel each other when we get to another topic. And then, of course, a single sign carries. So the difference between as purchased and edible yield is, what do I start with to get the result I need? As purchased into edible yield. We'll come back and figure these in a minute, but I just want to walk through and explain the template. So then we have our ingredient of what it is. That's pretty self-explanatory. In our invoice column here, this might be new to all of you. The invoice column is how we buy food. It's not like you do at the grocery store. It's not even like you do it at Sam's Club or BJ's or a wholesaler. So a broadline vendor, or even a produce company, or like ProFish that does seafood and fish, they have amounts that they sell, and they assign a case price to that, or if it's a protein like fish and it's caught, they charge you by the pound that fish is. They're not going to cut off the tail just to give you 10 pounds, because what do they do with that leftover fish tail? Same thing with you, that if you trim things off, you have to reappropriate them and try to make a sale out of it. So the cost is always going to be related to the unit here. It's just like over here in our measurements, we need 14 pounds, and of that 14 pounds, we need 14, but we only get an 82 yield. So that means we need to start with more here to get at least 14 at the end. Over here, we're now saying on this line, the cost is $24.61 by the unit of a pound. So that basically is saying for beef tenderloin fillet, it's $24.61 a pound. The issue is we need more than 1 pound. And we don't know this quantity yet that we had to start with because of trimming and so forth. So we'll come back to that. This ingredient lobsters, each lobster costs us $24. This here is where we get a little bit more of a challenge, but this is what you're going to see most typically in our industry. You're going to get a case price and the pack size that case is. For $36, you're going to get 22 pounds of green beans. This one for $52.30, you're going to get 12 pounds of asparagus. And you all probably see the correlation there, that green beans in the grocery store are cheaper than asparagus. Same thing to a business. Yukon Gold potatoes, $29.63 for 50 pounds. And you may not see it or recognize it, but I want to draw something out. If you look at these two and compare them against this one, there should be one glaring thing. And that is, let's use this example here and change it. Let's say the green beans are $36 for 36 pounds. We'll do the math later, but if you didn't know it, that would be $1 per pound. So when the cost is higher than the amount that you get, you're going to have more than $1 per pound. When you have a cost that's less than that, so if we have more than 29.63 pounds of potatoes, then the potatoes are going to be cheaper than a pound. And I mentioned that if you look at this recipe, and you know where I started, verifying the things at the top, left to right, without all of these items with numbers, the ones that are filled in and the ones that you will fill in, configuring these correctly to get this answer, these answers will never be right. So you will miss every answer after. Let's change that back there. We'll delete this here so we leave it the way it was. This one here, $15.60 for 64 ounces. You also could see that written as a half gallon. But how do you write 1/2 and gallon? You can't. If you know that, you could just put 64 ounces because that is easier to figure. The other thing is, if you look by having ounces here, it's going to match our edible portion and our as purchased based on this recipe. Lastly, to show you the gambit of the things that you would have to figure out when you're doing a recipe cost card, is going to be a case price again for 36 pounds. That's no different than any of these that you just saw. However, the recipe, because this column equals this or this, wants it in ounces. So when we go to figure this out, there's an entire extra step that we have to do before we can put our amount here to make sure that we are costing accurately. A couple more things to point out here. Please recognize that 22 pounds is a unit, which is why the numbers and letters are in the same column as opposed to separate columns here. And the reason it is $36 for 22 pounds. So that case, here it is, 22 pounds. It's hard to just break down. So in our recipe here, this is trying to align with our recipe and our as purchased. Our invoice, we don't do anything with that because we don't get to set those prices. So with the recipe, we have a cost and a unit. And what we want to do in this column is set the smallest value to break down our case price, because we don't always use an entire case when we're making a recipe. So we need to know what portion of it we are using. So we break it down to the smallest unit. So if it's pounds, breaking it down into a pound is the smallest unit that makes sense. We could go to an ounce, but that means we took an extra step to go down to an ounce, meaning we figured it to a pound and had to then divide by 16 ounces in a pound, and then we had to come back up to a pound because that's the way the recipe is written. Eaches are really easy because these match and it matches over here, so you'd actually just wind up carrying the number. This one, you're going to wind up having to divide. And the biggest question you have is, which number goes first? Well, if you go back to when I was trying to get you to see these two versus this one would be less than $1 than a pound. These would be more. So even if you didn't know how to do this, you could use a calculator to figure out what the number should look like. And that's the easiest way for me to remember things, especially to try to teach you. So if you put 36 in a calculator first, we type in 36 and divide it by 22 pounds in the case. And that's going to give us 1.63 repeating. So if you had made a determination that because it's more than the amount we get, it should be more than $1 per pound, then you've done it right. So what do you see? First column into the second column, or divided into it. And in this, just like with everything else, you overestimate expenses and you underestimate sales. That way, if anything doesn't meet your expectations, or you have more expenses, or you don't make as many sales, you've covered yourself. So I would encourage you to do one of two things. With this 6.3, that would be $1.63.63 over. I would either always just round up to the next penny, or I would round up at 0.2 or 0.3 or higher. If you look at parts of pennies, you don't think that they matter that much, but I would go ahead and make sure you round up because you're always covering it. If you do 100,000 people a year, that's 100,000 pennies. And then you can divide that down to how many dollars that is. And that's just on one ingredient. So I would round this to $1.64. So let's clear that. So our answer here be 1.64. And what that's now saying is it's $1.64 a pound. When we get to this column, we'll move back over here to see how many pounds we had to use and how much that total cost us to prepare this recipe of 80 portions. And we would do the same process here. But for comparison's sake, let's look at this. So let's get our calculator back. Left column first, so $29.63 per case of 50 pounds. We divide by 50, and that gives us 59.26. So again, I would just round this to 0.6, or 60 cents per pound. And then we would again come back over here and use this. For this example, we're going to do the same thing. But again, there is an extra step that we have to remember, and that is we need to make sure the units match. And we want to take our invoice cost, break it down so it matches the recipe unit that we need. So again, left column first, 88.52 divided by 36 equals that. So what that is telling you is it's going to be $2 with rounding and 46 cents. So $2.46. Let's just put that right there so you can see it. But that's for a pound. But we want ounces. So we'll take that same thing, clear out your calculator, and do 2.46 and divide it. Well, Chef, I don't know what we divide it by. We divide it by the number of ounces that are in a pound, and that never changes. So I hope that all of you've memorized 16 ounces in a pound. So to take a pound at $2.46, we divide it by 16, it's going to tell us that that $2.46 is split 16 times, and that'll tell you what your ounce price is, or our lowest or smallest unit. Notice I've stayed away from volumes here because weights are always the best, most consistent measurement, but we can practice volumes on another problem if we need to. Divide it by 16 ounces per pound, and in the 2 pounds, 246 per pound and 16 ounces per pound, so the pounds will cancel. You'll be left with ounces. Morgan. And that gives us 15 cents. So I would put in here that for an ounce of butter, it's 16 cents with the rounding. And that's what you would do for this entire column. We will do the problem together, but again, I'm still walking you through. This column here, as mentioned, this is the total individual ingredient cost. Biggest thing to remember here is you use your as purchased column times your unit costs to get this answer. Chef, why don't we use recipe? This is the amount that we're left with after we started with this much and we cleaned it and we lost, or the difference, or the yield. So again, just to clarify, what this is saying is if I start off with 15.74 pounds of green beans, after I clean and snip the ends and pull out any bad ones, I'm only going to have 95.3% of a pound left. So I need to use this number and this number to get this one. And we haven't covered it yet, but right to left we need to multiply, because we're starting with this much. Multiply it by this, it tells us what percent we have left of this. So if we have our calculator again, so we have 15.74. We're going to multiply it by 95.3%, or you could turn it into the decimal, which is moving the decimal 2 places to the left, 0.953. Don't leave off the decimals or the small portions or the numbers. That's going to give us 15.0002. Now, because of math and rounding and all of that, you're going to think the 0.002 is extremely important. But it's not in this instance. It's really just trying to give you really nice numbers to work with. So to get 15 pounds that we need for our recipe to serve 80 people, I needed to start with 15.74 pounds, or an extra 12 ounces. Because if you think about a decimal of a pound, 0.75, 16 ounces times 0.75, that gives you 12. So by cleaning 15 pounds of green beans, or 15.74, it gives us 15, or we lose 0.74. If we don't count this in this column, we now are undercharging because we overused the ingredient and charged at a lesser amount. And that's how we do it. So what's the opposite of multiplying? Dividing. So where would we divide? Going left to right. And it's the same process over and over. And again, throughout this class, these same principles will be applied over and over in different areas. So we'll come back again and practice this problem. However, let's go ahead and clear this out So we're focusing just on what we're trying to look at here. So once we've done that, have our AP quantities and multiply it by the ingredient column. That gives us our total ingredient cost per item for the recipe. So this one is you're going to add all of those up together. That tells us how much it costs to make this recipe for 80 people. Q factor is for all the ingredients that it's really hard to measure or they're just pennies, but you still have to account for them. Q factor is often for like pepper and salt, just frying oil to fry something in, any of your dry spices that you're not using a whole container or cups of. That way at least it's still being included. And a Q factor is designed for those items that are just super small in amounts and small pennies, but you're still accounting for them. So we have our total cost before Q factor. We use that with this number. So we would take the number, multiply it by 0.088%, and that'll tell us how many dollars is. So if we have 200 here, so we take 200, multiply it by the decimal form of 8.8%, which would be that. So our Q factor for 80 people is going to be about $17.60. Our recipe cost now is 200 plus 17.60. Our portion cost, our total recipe, by the number of portions we get. Not the size of the portion, but the yield. How many are we serving with this $217 of food? So we just divide it by 80. Again, we're going to do the whole problem because these are just fake numbers here that do not align with this specific recipe. So we're basically saying to serve 80 people, we use this much money to do it. So per person, that it comes out to $2.72. These line items here are completely related to additional costs that can be incurred. Market fluctuation, sometimes you just build that in when you're writing a menu, so you don't have to change your menu over and over and over. Price of seafood goes up in and out of season, or produce, or there's a bad weather year for tomatoes or oranges, that you can build that in, so you don't have to just change your price because of that anomaly. Additional labor, the example I use is maybe you're doing this tableside service, so you have to pay a cook to do that as opposed to a server sometimes. So additional labor expense that you have to build in because they're not in a kitchen cooking for many, they're cooking for one or two or a table of 8 at a time. Additional dining items, which is what this box says, that you can't quite see there. And that would be if you're serving lobster, you might need to have wet naps. Obviously, if you're a fine dining restaurant, you may not, but you want to include those expenses. Or if you're serving crackers or drawn butter and people can get more if they use it all, you need to build that in. You can't just say, oh, I'll give it to you. Same reason why McDonald's says 2 sauces per 10 nuggets. Well, I want 4. Well, we have to charge you because what we've charged you we did not include for that. And if they included it for everybody, there'd be other people that are upset because they're getting overcharged and they don't even use sauces at all. In any matter, you would take your portion cost, add any additional costs, and that becomes your total plate cost. Our desired food cost percent is what we need to hit to make our business run efficiently and to make a profit by the end of the year. Those two numbers working together ultimately give you your preliminary selling price. And it's used as preliminary because that's not what you put on the menu. That number is arbitrary, and what it means is it's doing it by math. Meaning this and this, it tells you what 28% is. That's it. But that number could be really funny, like $13.71. You don't put that on the menu. What if that cost is too high comparatively to a competitor next door, or it's too low knowing that you should be able to sell that for more because the competitor next door does? So what I've given you is the actual selling price that you would use and put on your menu. You would normally need to figure this out. Finally, you then would use the preliminary and the actual selling price to figure out what your actual cost percent is. This is desired. What is it actually, because I didn't use that number that this came up with. So that's the introduction to the recipe cost card.